The story of cars in Australia is one of unrequited love, a love of freedom on four wheels. But the dream of the wide open road led us to some powerful struggles to become who we are today. In 1970, there were 4 million cars on Australian roads. Today, there are over 16 million, nearly one for each of us. Epic battles would play out on the nation's streets. Inner city trendies versus the suburbs. Heroes versus villains. Australia versus the world. It was the era of the car wars. And now you can go any place that you want to go. Australia got its 60s in the 70s. Far away from San Francisco and Carnaby Street, our revolution was different. It wasn't all about peace. In Australia, it was tank tops, tattoos, alcohol, and aggro. In the 70s, we lived life pedal to the metal. There was a heedlessness about the times, and it spawned a suburban revolution on wheels.
We drove around the suburbs on a Friday or Saturday night drunk, doing handbrake turns and spinning out on oil. And, you know, like, we would never get out of the car. I sort of keep the window. I just wind the window down if you want to throw up, but, like, get the window done up most of the time. Now, we didn't belong anywhere, mate. We belonged in the car.
That's what boys did with girls in the car. They'd show off and they'd scare the girls witless.
Generally, you had to be pretty drunk to go roof surfing, and you'd both grab a hold of the roof racks, and your mates underneath take off. And you just hang on as tight as you can.
It was a period of social upheaval not seen before in Australia. The animals were out at the farmyard. Watch out for the pigs.
We didn't have firearms, we didn't have pepper spray. All we had was a little rubber baton, but when you came time to try and get it out in a hurry, because it was rubber, it would stick to the clothing in the pocket and you just couldn't get it out. So you ended up either having to try and talk your way out of it or just go down swinging. So that was the best you could do.
Deep divisions were appearing between the inner city and the suburbs. Out on the edge of town, a car army was massing. In the 1970s, the Whitlam government had spawned a new breed of fluffy-haired, university-educated, creative types who were reclaiming rundown inner-city areas like Carlton in Melbourne.
We Carltonites loathed people with cars because they parked on our footpaths. They parked across our drives. They were aggressive and assertive people from the outer suburbs or from somewhere else. They didn't understand the culture that we were developing around Carlton.
Does an underground theatre group mean that's a radical group, that it has, you know, a radical bias socially and politically?
Yes, we've got a reasonably radical bias politically, I suppose. And I lived early on with quite militant feminists who were even more disdainful of the notion of cars and the men that had cars.
But as a young actor, Graham Blundell found himself cast as one of the enemy. He became Alvin Purple, Australian TV's answer to Valentino, doomed to always having it off in a car.
I was this kind of bizarre, you know, Australia's first bizarre sex symbol. The most unlikely person ever to be a sex symbol in the history of sex, or films, for that matter.
With this huge car, any sort of man could get lucky. Even a simpering wimp from the inner city.
I did fall into these rather odd, well, they became very famous commercials for Charger.
Good night, everybody. Like a lift soothing? Anyone?
Fred Skepsey thought I'd be a good person to do a series of commercials he was doing for this suddenly very glamorous, rather sexy car called the Charger.
Anyone?
And I was there, the Alvin Purple character.
Good night, girls.
This sort of rather hapless, sort of innocent.
Would anyone like a lift?
Driving this massively powerful car, and all these girls running past going, "Hey, Charger! Hey, Charger!
Hey, Charger! Hey, Charger!"
It was so powerful, the back end of it used to swing around each time you take a corner. So I had young children at that stage, so the Charger had to go. It was just far too terrifying and demonic. It was like a Stephen King presence in my family.
But out in the suburbs, Aussie battlers never had it so good. In 1972, the unemployment rate was 2%. The family car was growing fatter with the times. Big families in big cars needed big roads, and anything in the way was scheduled for demolition. It was a battle over territory. In Melbourne, local residents and student radicals built barricades to block the newly opened Eastern Freeway. It was one of the first battlegrounds of the growing environmental movement.
What's happened here, the government has announced they're going to open a freeway through here, construct a Gold Street, which is about half a mile off the road, and then make this existing roadway a freeway. And so we're putting in curbing, which creates a 16-foot carriageway. That means effectively the road will be one lane.
The neighbourhoods that were once seen as slums are now, of course, seen as beautiful historic areas, which are in danger of being blitzed by freeways. So they knew, of course, they were not going to stop it. But it was a symbolic protest that detains the police and the authorities for quite a while.
Let's go to the freeway, smash, 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 down come the trees and...
The car industry was too big to stop. By the early 70s, the big three car makers, Holden, Ford and Valiant, employed 300,000 people. It was a source of national pride, central to the economy and our identity.
I think it was one of the nation-building projects that this country had, really, you know, and Victoria was the heart of that, you know, the heartland of manufacturing. And the key of manufacturing was automotive as well. It was the mainstay of it, and it was seen as the elite part of manufacturing. You know, the high-skilled, high-wage jobs, the jobs for life.
But other countries made cars for half the price that we did. By putting taxes on imported cars, the government kept the local car industry afloat. It was called protection.
The effective rate of protection on a car was about 93%. So a car worth $20,000 today would be just on $40,000, which meant working people were paying far more of their income out simply for the privilege of the protection for the industry.
It was Fortress Australia versus the world. And events over in the Middle East suddenly began to cause problems back here.
In my life, I've never stopped to worry about a thing.
In 1973, an international oil crisis began when the Arab oil barons turned off the taps as a protest against American military aid to Israel. Rationing was enforced across Australia. Prices skyrocketed and commuters hit the roof. Was this a premonition of an awful possibility? That one day the Bowsers might completely run dry. As the oil crisis held the country in a squirrel grip, British Leyland chose this moment to take on the big three.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Leyland P76.
They had researched what Australian road users wanted. It led them to design the P76, the biggest bugger of them all.
It's an amazing car. It's so easy to drive. People look at it and they say, oh, it's a real big car. And quite often people behind me say, oh, as soon as I catch you, will you let me pass? Well, they never catch me, of course. They're very light. They're like a big go-kart to drive.
But Leyland had problems from the start, with local factories crippled by strikes and motorists nervous about the high petrol prices. The P76 was a relic almost before it was made. Hundreds were left rusting in the storage yard.
Cars say a lot about who you are. You know, the P76, if you drove a P76, it meant you couldn't spell loser. They were the big lemons.
The death of the P76 was a taste of things to come. It was perfect timing for a bolshy new TV show all about cars. The host, Peter Werrett, was a unique combination of rev-haired and Renaissance man, and he could see the danger signs ahead.
It's been suggested from time to time that I'm somewhat cynical about the modern motor car, and I guess it's true to say that I am. But I'm certainly not cynical about driving them. For me, driving a car is a tremendous source of personal pleasure. I enjoy it thoroughly. But I'm not unaware of the problems the motor car brings. Every year we build bigger, better roads, and to do so we pull down houses and we rip up trees and all sorts of natural vegetation. Every year we strip the earth of more of its natural resources in order to satisfy the needs of the motor car. And clearly we can't go on doing that forever.
But in Bathurst, no one gave a f***. In 1973, just in case they weren't using enough petrol, they extended the race. It became the Bathurst 1000. And one Sunday each year, it stopped the nation.
I'm just sitting in my chair when a voice comes on and yells, don't you try it, you feel alright. Got some green new brand of smoke, chill your head and clear your throat. Keeps you
A new hero appeared, like a young Greek god descending on Mount Parnassus. Peter Brock paraded before his adoring followers at Mount Panorama.
What is there to be said? Mount Panorama has seen the running of yet another classic Hardy Ferodo 1000. Peter Brock and Brian Sampson have taken their Tirana to a well-earned victory in a race notable for incident and drama.
Peter Brock and Brian Sampson.
Although Brock has won here before, this instant, this feeling, transcends all others because, quite simply, this is Bathurst.
Yeah, it's certainly a fairly excellent feeling, really, Harry.
If hippie handsome Peter Brock was winning at Bathurst, then there was no crisis on the roads worth worrying about. He was the white knight in flares.
Brocky was so easy to like, you know, and I think he probably, in many ways, was like Hoax to me, I reckon. You try, it wasn't because he's funny, but he was just a cool dude.
He's a legend. He's my god. My bloody oath. Brocky!
Hey, Brocky!
Brocky!
Peter Brock's faithful followers were suburban drivers. They saw before them a driver with supernatural powers.
His connection was so powerful, he dreamt his races. So in the nights leading up to, he'd be braking, he knew the tracks, he had this intimate, and you could sense where he was on the track with the way he was sleeping. He'd brake. and so he'd get onto the track and he was outside the car, so he knew around the corner if there was something amiss, and he'd lift off at the right time.
If Peter Brock driving for Holden was the white knight, the black knight driving for Ford was a cranky Canadian called Allan Moffat.
Got to get him out there because
the Holden boys didn't like us winning. Peter Brock had won his first Bathurst in '72. I'm told the whole GM dealer network were absolutely enchanted with that. For us to come back the next year with a new shaped car and win it, they weren't happy little chooks after the race.
Holden versus Ford was a rivalry that thrived along every suburban street in the country.
It was like there was a hero and the anti-hero. Here was the guy representing Holden, the all-Australian car. Here he was, this brash young bloke who was the everyday approachable man. Then in the other corner, driving for Ford, the big corporate sort of enemy conglomerate like the Battlestar, like really evil, with this guy who didn't quite talk like us, and seemed a bit up himself. So you sided with him or you sided with the other guy. But they couldn't have got more different personalities and more polarising personalities in Australia if you tried.
Bathurst was the bedrock of Australian car culture. The die-hard fans supported their company like a football team.
You couldn't help seeing the red flags in the grandstand when Brocky was in front, and when the blue flags were up, I was in front. It was just part of the scene. We had to drive the cars, and we did that to the best of our ability. The people that gained from our abilities behind the wheel were the car companies. We sold cars for the car companies.
Australia, what's your favourite sport?
Football.
Snack?
Pies.
Animal?
Kangaroos.
And what's your favourite car, Australia?
Holden.
Let me see, that's football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars, huh?
Right.
Well, you sure sound like Australia to me.
We are.
In the 70s, the Ocker Image sold big, blokey cars.
Football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars. Football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
That's football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
Football and meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
And from the safety of their Holdens, Australian men thought they had a licence to go feral.
I once got the EH and half a kilo of chops and rubbed the whole car with chops and the hubcaps and everything. And some of my friends were stoners, and they let them have a bit of a smoke, and I took them out to the African lion safari. Now, when the king of the beasts gets hold of what it thinks is a 2-ton chop full of people, it goes berserk.
Makes sense to me.
If men felt safe being silly in their big cars, Australian women were making their own decisions about what cars to buy.
At long last, we have found a car which isn't made just for the men. The car is absolutely littered with shelves. There are so many shelves for all those odds and ends you don't fit into the normal handbag.
Why it is the perfect put together. You Datsun 120Y.
Japanese cars didn't reinforce manhood, but they were a practical alternative. It would take some persuading for Australian men to buy Japanese. Women in bikinis helped.
The ad agency I was with got the Nissan account through a local distributor,
And no one was too happy about advertising Japanese cars because there was still that World War II hangover around the place. Plus there was other Japanese stuff around which was of very low quality.
As far as handling's concerned, I guess one could hardly describe it as a spirited performer. It takes some considerable time to get it moving at any sort of speed.
But the Japanese were here to stay. And by 1975, they had over 30% of the new car market.
The emotional reaction of certain types of Australians to the whole Jap car invasion, it's not rational, and it's moving away from the old image of the blokey, Aussie, working class, outdoorsy Australian to a more urban, more professional, more not necessarily white at all, and definitely not necessarily male Australian.
Australia was changing, and cars were speeding up the rate of change. But safety was something that followed later. In the mid-70s, there were nearly 10 million less people in the country. Still, the road toll was 4 times what it is today. Around 3,500 people per year were killed. At the heart of the problem was the popular take on drinking and driving, which went, if you drink and drive, you're a bloody idiot. But if you make it home, you're a legend.
I've got to say that in terms of drink driving back then, there didn't seem to be any major push to stop it, apart from the police station cars outside known watering holes like RSL clubs. And usually on Friday, Saturday night, there'd be a cop car there, which was to deter people from drinking, I think, but mostly people would be driving past a cop car weaving home.
We only had to go a little way, about 4 blocks from sort of the pub to get back to my place. So we came up with this ingenious plan that they would sit in the car and drive, and to be safe, I would walk in front. I would walk in front of the vehicle. So that's what we did. We got home. We got home. I said it's a thing in Australia, isn't it? I mean, you have to drive. You're too pissed to walk.
Australian researchers were the first in the world to make a connection between the crashes and drivers' alcohol level. Our statistics were sobering.
We pulled people out of the traffic stream and breathalyzed them. There was simple breathalyzer was in existence then, and we had them for research purposes. We were getting figures like up to 10% in the urban areas of people had levels which we would now regard as hazardous and beyond the law. That is, 1 in 10 drivers are driving with a hazardous level of alcohol in what is mostly his blood, I have to say. I was going to say his or her, but they were practically all men.
You just take that and blow into the mouthpiece, and with one continuous breath, inflate the bag, please.
To reduce drinking and driving, they would have to make the Aussie bloke do a U-turn, and that was going to take time.
We drank and drove all the time. That's a horrible admission to make, but it was true. You know, when I was 17 years of age, even old timers say, oh, mate, have a few drinks, but just make sure you stay on the left-hand side of the line and you'll be right. No worries. I can't believe I lived through my teens, to be quite honest with you. And we would always be trying to set speed records. And we'd be, be 8 guys in a hotted-up Falcon on the, on the F4, just looking at the speed, going, 140, 145, 150, 155 miles an hour. I mean, we were absolutely mad.
I'm the Night Rider!
But while some were trying to cut the road carnage, others were relishing it. That was way more exciting. A young casualty doctor who had seen the horror firsthand took this bitumen battleground to the world. George Miller created our ultimate road warrior, Mad Max.
At that time, George Miller had been working as a young doctor in a hospital where he was seeing these maimed people brought in from the roads, and in a way it's the grotesque features of that whole experience that become magnified in the Mad Max scenarios, but he enlarges it into a kind of gothic horror story about the way the motor car has become an instrument both of adventure and of death at the same time.
Here was an Australian film everyone wanted to see.
When the crashes happened, they were spectacular because the roads were so basic.
You better send a meat truck. Charlie's copped a saucepan in the throat. Hey, Max!
So George had seen a lot of this, and certainly he communicated that to us when we were sort of preparing to make the film. And there's certainly that within the film, you know, that thing about that black ribbon of road that is the artery and the life, but is also the death, you know, and the carnage.
Mad Max was also inspiring real highway patrolmen.
In a way, I was never trying to emulate, you know, Mad Max. A good traffic cop's usually got a little bit of hoon in his blood somewhere.
John Dyball was a pursuit cop in the lonesome wild west of Australia. He drove the same patrol car as Max, a supercharged 351 Ford. He loved it so much that he bought it when the government sold it off, and he's done 300,000 Ks in it, keeping the Mad Max dream alive.
Afternoon, I just checked you on radar at 130 and 110 zone. You got any reason why you're driving so fast?
Every day, John Dyball saw real accidents up close, and it wasn't too far removed from the movie.
At the police academy, we take recruits to the morgue, but I don't go because I don't want to bring back those memories and those smells. I don't want that as a lasting effect on me. I've put those things way to the back of my mind now, and I don't want them coming forward again.
What was hard to deal with at work for a cop fascinated the public when they saw it on the big screen. It struck a deep chord for a Hoon nation.
Something about the Mad Max movies and the way they treated cars that seemed to somehow symbolise the essential sort of adolescent that seems to lurk at the heart of Australia, this sort of dark, strange heart. It wasn't just the way that we blew the cars up with such delight, though that was great fun. It was the way we just used them to sort of rampage across the landscape, to destroy the landscape.
When it first started and went to the hardtops and the drive-ins, there were police cars out the front of every movie theatre, because people would just come out so revved up about it all. They were smoking up the main streets and, you know, doing donuts in the middle of Flinders Street and in the city, you know. I remember the premiere in Melbourne. It was like just people arcing it up. It was like a licence to go. It's now in popular culture. It says we're OK.
Where were the cops? I can't recall ever being pulled up by the police in my youth, ever.
While Vince Sorrenti's suburban car culture was a very masculine world, it didn't mean women weren't allowed into the vehicles on special occasions.
Hey, why is the rear vision mirror so wide?
Yeah, the car was a bit of a boudoir. It was a place where you presented yourself to the lady, and she was impressed by the 8-ball on your gear stick. And she was impressed by the array of religious figures on your dashboard. It was like a peacock fanning its feathers, mate. You know, this is my car. What do you think?
It's unreal. Excellent. Fantastic.
How would you like to go out with someone that had a car like this?
I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind.
It'd be great. Mm? Be great. You'd be proud?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? What would make you proud?
Noise.
Noise.
The rougher looking the bloke, the better his car was, to be frank. All the big, fat, sort of ugly guys had hot enough, good-looking cars. It made up for everything.
According to the coming-of-age book Puberty Blues, nearly all Australians lost their virginity in a car. It was the only place you could get away from Dad. But the ultimate sex machine was a remodelled tradesman's van.
If you were a little bit classy as a chick, you didn't go out with a guy with a panel fan. It was very classy.
The back of a Sandman? Of course. Of course.
These would be backed up to the surf side, in a line right along the beach, wherever you could fit them, and they'd be full of people. Some of the doors closed, others not.
The Sandman panel vans often had those airbrush paintings down the side with the swarthy Amazon, with the nipples so erect you could hang your wetsuit on them.
There was even a panel van show I can remember where I had to go along to open this panel van show, which had all these massive panel vans all painted with naked girls and spray painted kind of thing, and I felt quite ill at ease at the whole thing.
Well, I've done a lot of travelling in this and a lot of sleeping, and with motel, say $22 a night, they're terribly practical, and you've got the cocktail bars here if you want a little practical.
Walking on the beaches, looking at the beaches.
Earth is the only planet we've got.
But just to spoil everyone's fun, a second oil crisis struck in 1979 when the Shah of Iran was ousted, and delivering oil to the West wasn't a priority. The bad news for motorists was delivered in gentle tones.
Part of the problem is you and I, the ordinary motorists. We use up to 65% of all of Australia's petrol.
All that is absolutely true, and there are ways that you and I can help.
Quite plainly, conservation is going to be a major factor in vehicle design.
The Fraser government began to make noises about alternative fuels and rationing.
And I'm glad to see that the industry in Australia has accepted greater use of LPG or greater use of diesel.
But at Bathurst, they still didn't give a f***. Fuel rations were introduced. Spectators were limited to one slab of beer each per day. The fans witnessed Ford's greatest moment in 1977 when Allan Moffat and Colin Bond finished 1-2.
A scene we've never seen before, side by side, and Moffat from the outside will sweep around and take the checkered flag first.
But Brocky was about to come into his heyday. From the late 70s, he was the prince in the Principality of Hoons, and special fans rode the mountain with him.
Brocky used to have a habit of deliberately scaring journos and people in the car with him. He would go out of his way and would drive full tilt. He wasn't just a casual tootle around the mountain to have a look at the sights and watch the kangaroos. He was just flat stick.
Yeah, he went really fast. He went really fast. It was fantastic.
So we start off, and even the first time up Mountain Straight, the heat coming through the firewall, the smell, the noise bouncing around what is in essence a metal box, the grin on his face is the other thing that I'll never forget. He could tell he was enjoying scaring me and he was enjoying just driving the mountain.
And Brocky, once more, is king of the mountain.
From 1978, Peter Brock won 7 out of 10 Bathursts. He may have been king of the mountain, but what was underneath the crown?
Well, I think he was obviously very talented. He had a lot of confidence in himself. And look, as I say, as a driver, fantastic. As a person, well, that's another story.
Like, he had the reputation for being a bit of a pants man, and a bit of a pants man. How, you know, even Bev Brock, his partner for 30-odd years, conceded that she had to watch him like a hawk.
You know, he had women in their 90s following him around Australia. He had, you know, little kids. I'd see little 2-year-olds just sit in their fathers and stroke his face and gaze at him, and you don't get that with strangers, and that's because he did have that extremely magnetic, dedicated liking of people.
Nothing stuck. He was Teflon. He used to sprinkle the stardust and people would flutter their eyelids. They loved him.
Brock was a national sex symbol, a rock star of a driver.
Ladylike, smile at me again.
And the Black Knight, Allan Moffat, had been left in his exhaust fumes. Ford retired from Bathurst after adverse publicity about the dangerous cars they were building. Moffat was out of a job. For him, it seemed the party was over.
Please accept our apology for the inconvenience.
are gonna have to cause you. So
meanwhile, the federal government was politely asking the country to change their ways.
How will you go when you sit for the test?
Random breath testing went national in 1982.
How will you go when you sit for the test? Will you be under oath?
To a hard-drinking nation, this was controversial.
How will you go when you sit for the test? Will you be under oath, fight, or under arrest?
I think it's developing into a bit of a police state, this place. Why should we be stopped at any hour of the night or day and be put through the rigours of a breathalyser test?
I think it's an infringement on our civil rights. I think it's OK for Melbourne, but not Sydney. We're real human beings up here.
I think it's probably a good idea to keep the road toll down.
They won't catch me.
But RBT was begrudgingly accepted.
Australians are interesting in that we believe in liberty, but we also have a strong utilitarian streak. If you can demonstrate to Australians that something which might seem to affect their liberty is causing them nonetheless deadly harm, then Australians are, at the end, are prepared to surrender a bit of their liberty in a way that perhaps Americans and perhaps even the British are not prepared to do.
But liberty wasn't the only thing Australians were surrendering. A whole industry was under siege. In the roundabout capital of the world, Canberra, the Labor government saw trouble ahead.
The first thing to say is that Australia's in a recession. The most important thing about that is that this is a recession that Australia had to have.
Shielded by the popularity of his leader, Bob Hawke, Keating set about tearing down the walls of Fortress Australia. He floated the Aussie dollar. Then he turned his focus on the car industry.
Now, right this very day, protections for the motor vehicle industry are still 104%.
Labor Minister John Button was given the job of making our car industry internationally competitive.
I think this plan will stay, and I think it will drastically change the face of the Australian car industry, and I believe it will be for the better.
The Button car plan aimed to reduce the number of local car models from 13 to 8 in order for the local industry to survive.
This plan has been closed by government action, and we're now finding a Labor government in Canberra is saying not only will we close the plant by government action, but we'll take about 1/3 of your superannuation also.
The unions jumped straight into bed with the manufacturers immediately against the government. That's as it always was. So I think, you know, Button's great achievement was to get some consensus about a restructuring, and then my job was to put the thumbscrews on them.
To economise, the car companies introduced global models. A German car became the Holden Commodore.
I guess I was pissed that we were going to get the German car shoved down our throat. I didn't really like that. I thought we knew how to do it better than they did for Australia. And if we took the German car, it was going to be too small to start with. So I thought it would be a good idea. In fact, I even put the proposal up to management. I can draw you a Commodore, but it's all based on the HQ architecture. No, they wouldn't wear that. I mean, if they wanted to look like a Commodore, I can make one look like a Commodore, but we'll do it on a bloody Kingswood.
The same car became known as a Toyota Lexan. And the days of following your car like a football team came to an end. The rationalisation was more than Ford could take. Their international boss, Wayne Booker, made the long trip to Canberra to announce they were getting out of the country.
When Booker came to see me, he told me about Ford pulling out. And I said, well, look, you know, you haven't asked me the right question. And the right question is, does the government believe there should be a motor industry? And he said, well, what's your answer to your own question? I said, well, the answer is I do. I do.
Keating's sweet talking meant Ford stayed on, but across the board, the workforce shrank. The Australian car industry survived, but took a massive haircut.
I was one of 3 accountants that was given the job of working out what we got rid of. And as a result of that, Holden's closed Pagewood, they basically closed Fisherman's Bend, the old plant, Dandenong, Acacia Ridge, and Holden's went from 16,000 employees to about 8,000 in 4 years. I was still a young guy, and I found it very difficult making a decision that led to people losing their jobs.
While the romance of the road seemed to have gone forever, in motor racing, sparks were flying. An unexpected new partnership was blossoming.
Whoa! Not much between them. There was almost a touch.
It all began when an unemployed Allan Moffat received an invitation to take tea with Peter Brock.
Morning tea developed into a long lunch. The long lunch developed into afternoon tea. And Peter said, "Al, we're going to take a car." It's the only one that called me Al, by the way. We're going to take a car to Europe and find out what these Europeans are all about in their little, I won't tell you what he called them, their little cars. We're going to take a Commodore over there and kick a little backside, I think is the phrase. Okay. And we'll kick off the season by taking on the Wellington 500. We won the race. First time we got together, we won the race. We both said afterwards, almost simultaneously, why didn't we do this a decade earlier?
It was a confusing romance for the fans, Ford and Holden together. The 80s was the time of the new age. Brock gave up alcohol and cigarettes and became a vegan. In partnership with his healer, he designed a new age gadget to harness the chaotic energy patterns of his customised Commodores.
This was the device, $467 fitted to the firewall of your car that changed Brock's business. He was going along very nicely with Holden. Plenty of cars being done, everyone liked them, and unfortunately he, in league with a chiropractor friend of his, got involved in crystal power. I actually named the thing more as a joke than anything else, because he just called it the device. I said, you can't call it a device. It's an energy polariser, isn't it? Yes, it is, said he. Holden didn't like any of this at all because they thought it might invalidate their warranties. So they just said, well, look, you can't put these things on.
GM might back me with a bit of kind and might pat me on the back occasionally and say, well, keep at it, you know, what you're doing is good stuff and we agree with it. But we have arguments. Sometimes they want to do something one way, I want to do it another.
Peter at that stage was doing so well, he just said, no, you're being too conservative. I say they're going on and they are going on. So they sacked him.
But the fans loved Brocky more than ever. It was battler versus big business. The fallen Messiah still stood guard over the sacred petrol pumps. But by the 90s, the battlers were feeling boxed in. The button plan had worked. A little too well. Cheap overseas cars filled Australian roads to bursting point. The car, once our beloved freedom machine, was feeling more like a prison. A new vehicle let you look down on the traffic. The four-wheel drive was part armoured car, part Australian dream.
Car manufacturers are still selling the dream of the open road, the dream of going to Cape York even though you'll never go there. That's what four-wheel drives are all about. when I'm rid of all that responsibility, all those things I think about all the time, I can just take off into the wild blue yonder and be that free person I always hoped I was going to end up being.
If I was Prime Minister or Treasurer today, I'd tax the backside of four-wheel drives. You know, there goes another bonehead, you know. There goes another bonehead, you know.
Modern life has become incredibly busy, incredibly hectic and incredibly constrained. Driving used to be fun. I remember it in the 70s. It's rarely fun now.
The sheer aggressiveness on our roads, the road rage, the shouting, the jeering, the gesturing is not something that you find anywhere else, in my experience, maybe in Vanuatu with the taxi drivers.
We like to think as human beings that we actually drive change. I don't think we do. I think human beings, and it doesn't matter whether you're a car manufacturer or who you are, we don't change really until it gets too uncomfortable to stay the same.
Change wasn't easy for Peter Brock either. In 2005, he turned 60. He was still racing and promising to stop.
He said to me one time, "This time I mean it, I have finally retired." And he said, "You'll be pleased." And I said, "Why will I be pleased?" And he said, "Well, I mean it this time." He said, "I've stopped dreaming my races. I've lost my timing." He'd lost that ability, that sense of connection with a car. And he was totally honest, open, raw when he made that statement, and I believed him.
I got a phone call saying Brock's crashed in this rally in WA. And I said, "Oh, yeah, so is there any car damage?" "Yeah, but he's damaged." I said, "No, he's not." He said, "Yeah, he is. He's got a sheet over him." I said, "He's got a what?" "He's got a sheet over him. I don't think he's alive anymore." I said, "What?" I said, "I don't believe this. Can't be happening." And I really couldn't, because he was an indestructible sort of guy who did what he wanted to do and would always come out of it okay.
And we could see him come down a section of the road, and then usually about 20 seconds later they come through our chicane. He didn't come through.
He left an indelible impression on an innumerable number of individuals because of his ability for the fan to stand, and we're going to miss him. I'm telling you, I'm so upset.
55 radio stations rang me that afternoon. I am not kidding. And I was very sad. I still am.
Something else died with Peter Brock. Australian car culture would never be the same.
It seems different now because there's more cars and they change teams, and the Ford Holden rivalry just seems just doesn't seem as intense as it used to be, you know. And I think maybe it is because the drivers change, or maybe we've got better things to worry about than hating people who drive Fords, or better, I don't know. But it was no true celebrities.
Overseas, the dream of the motor car was also dying. In Motortown, Detroit, Michigan, the home of the car, General Motors became bankrupt in the great financial crisis of the noughties.
No one would ever have predicted that, ever. General Motors was like gold. Working in General Motors was your career for life. And, you know, too big to fail, I think that was the slogan really for General Motors.
Now the great structures of Motortown stand like the pyramids, silent tributes to a past era. In Australia, we're at a fork in the road. Congestion and petrol consumption threaten to bring us to a standstill. Change is inevitable. Even in Bathurst, where a silent race may be part of our future.
Look, what I always say when people say, well, how are you going to convince rev heads to buy an electric car, is to say, well, look, after we leave them in the dust at the lights a couple of times, we'll sit down and have a quiet chat and say, look, son, in the future you can either have a fast car or a loud car, but you can't have both. All the new sports cars coming out now, all the exciting ones are electric. Things like the Tesla that's coming out of Silicon Valley, 0 to 100 in 3.8 seconds. The Audi e-tron, which was their sort of show car at the Frankfurt Motor Show, doesn't have an electric motor. It has 4, 1 in each wheel. Thing goes like a scolded cat.
I like the notion of electric cars and hybrid cars, and I still can't understand why we're not more advanced in the technology of these things. Of course, we know why. We all read every conspiracy novel that's around. We know why. It's all to do with oil, and it's all to do with America. We know why there are no electric cars. But I'd love to drive an electric car, though in fact I tend to drive an old ute.
My best girlfriend's got a hybrid. And it's, you know, she keeps telling me you've got to get one of these cars. And I just say, it looks like a cockroach, Laura. It is the ugliest car that I've ever seen. Until they make them cute, I'm not getting one.
I do quite like that you change your persona. As soon as you step into a ute, you're somebody else, mate. Oh, yeah, you talk differently. There you go. Yeah. You do this wonderful thing when you're driving around, you don't actually sort of wave at people. You go... There's this one feel, I haven't quite got it right, but there's this, it's so cool. It's so, I'm getting better at it. Not quite there yet, but I'm getting better.
Hybrid electric cars have been on sale in Australia for 10 years. But on average, only 3,000 are sold each year, compared to 1 million petrol cars. If things don't change, there will be more cars than people in 2020.
Most people, in their hearts, really still want private transport. So we're in that very scary space between what we've been used to and what we think we're entitled to and what, at the moment, is available to us.
But in Bathurst, they were never going to give a f***. Peter Brock might be dead, but his name lives on.
My name's John Braun. This is my wife, Jodie Braun. This is Monaro Brock, Joseph Braun. My eldest son, Kai Monaro Herbert Braun. This is Adele Mona Rose Braun. Mona Rose together is Monaros. And this is Jai Thomas Samuel, and the initials are GTS. And that's the Braun family.
Summer Nats in Canberra is an annual gathering of the Rev Head clans for a horsepower party. The petrol engine's days may be numbered, and the silent electric era might be just around the corner. But many of us aren't ready to let the thrill or the noise go just yet.
It's inevitable that it'll happen, but I think there'll be a deep nostalgia for that rev of a petrol engine. And I think we already feel that nostalgia. I mean, the smell of an old hotted up car that burned on super. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't get that with these unleaded jobs.
We hope you enjoyed the series final of Wide Open Road. You can find the book, CD and DVD of the series at ABC shops and centres. Next week, follow the fascinating journey of crumbling ancient houses brought back to life by passionate owners to become modern homes filled with extraordinary history in Restoration Home, next Sunday night on ABC1.